Welcome, everyone. Connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learned from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Welcome again, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. Thank you. And as we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details to share with you. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding in the chat box to select everyone so that we all know who is here, and feel free to share your thoughts and insights throughout the duration of the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate portions of the conversation to respond to those questions you post, and our panelists will be typing out responses as well. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as all resources, slides, and bios, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And lastly, we'll be posting a brief on-screen poll during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we get started, I just wanted to flag some of our upcoming webinars that we have. Next week on March 4th at 3 p.m., we hope you'll join us for a look at the implications, challenges, and opportunities with for-profit childcare, where we'll be hearing from experts in the field and their insights. On March 11th, we'll be continuing the Decoding NAEP series with a discussion on what NAEP scores mean for students, families, and communities with parent perspectives. On March 18th, we'll be having our Funder to Funder conversation return with a discussion focused on harnessing the power of communities to help children. That will be in partnership with the Bezos Family Foundation, which will introduce the national partners in the ELN Collective and explore how they are leveraging their collective assets to ensure all young children get a great start in life. And on the 18th, we have another exciting session within our Decoding NAEP series, this time with conversation with the state chiefs. And so all of the registration links and information for those sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. And joining you now is John Gompertz, executive partner with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks, Sierra, and hello, friends. Thanks again for joining us for this now fourth in our series on decoding NAEP. We began this series with a broad sweep approach to the NAEP data and have steadily been working our way down into deeper insights and towards actionable strategies. We started with the overall headlines, then we dug deeper into who's scoring below basic and what does that mean, and started talking about opportunities to bend the curve around that concerning trend. Last week, we heard about the Education Recovery Scorecard, which has much more extensive data than NAEP, and then we looked specifically at the impact of chronic absenteeism on kids' progress and recovery, and started to look at some of the strategies that various states are taking to increase daily attendance. Overall, the NAEP data remain deeply concerning, but through this series, we've learned that looking only at the averages masks both the more profound challenges and some of the successes that we see happening in particular areas, successes that we think can inform action in other communities. So one of the things that the major headlines and stories about NAEP often miss is that the report actually includes data on how different types of schools are performing, including Catholic schools and charter schools, Department of Defense schools, as well as a slice on performance in different geographic areas like rural and urban communities. That is what we want to take a look at today. Visiting with some old and some new friends, we'll be listening to insights we'll be listening for insights and ideas that we can extract from those very specific contexts and apply in broader contexts. I'm pretty confident you're going to find those insights and ideas valuable. I think we'll all be taking a bunch of notes. Also, to make sure that you get what you're looking for out of this session, I want to change up our basic approach a little today. Typically, we assume that we'll get to audience questions in the last little part of the session. Today, I'm hoping that we can fold audience questions in much earlier. So I'm going to start with brief conversations with each of our guests. Then all the guests will come together for a group conversation. And I'm hoping that we can start to respond to audience questions while also lifting up some of the cross-cutting themes that we hear in those opening remarks. So don't be shy. Put your questions in the Q&A box, and the smart people behind the scenes will feed me some questions that will help to shape the conversation. So thanks for that. And now let me tell you about our guests today. Ray Hart is back with us again, repeat performance. He's the executive director of the Council of Great City Schools and has more than 30 years of experience in research and evaluation. Drew Jacobs is the senior director of policy, research, and evaluation at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Kathleen Porter McGee, who is also back for a return engagement, is the managing partner for Leadership Roundtable. And prior to joining Leadership Roundtable's team, she was the superintendent of Partnership Schools, which is a network of Catholic elementary schools in New York City and Cleveland. Melissa Sadorf is the executive director of the Arizona Rural Schools Association and the immediate past president of the National Rural Education Association. Beth Chavino Narvez is the director of the Department of Defense Activity, DODEA. And it's also a return engagement for Beth in a new seat. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Each of our guests brings a special angle or perspective to the NAEP results and the broader question of how we're doing in academic recovery and acceleration. So I'm going to do a short interview with each of them, drawing out their reactions to the recent NAEP data, any special reflections or insights for the slice of schools on which they focus. Then we'll try to draw some observations from their experiences that we can apply more broadly, and we'll try to get your questions involved in the conversation. Ray, can you join us? Ray Hart, can you join us as to kick us off?
Happy to join you, and thank you very much for having us as part of the panel. So looking forward.
You bet. We always love conversations with you. In case anybody who's listening today hasn't spent time with you before, can you just give us the quick remind of what the Council of Great City Schools is and what it does?
Happy to. So first of all, I just want to thank all the staff and the teachers, principals, administrators, superintendents, school board members. The council has been around since 1956. We represent 78 of the largest urban school districts across the country. Work closely with their staffs, but also work closely with administrators from the department and those in Congress on their behalf.
Gotcha. Okay, fantastic. So you were paying attention when the recent data came out. Tell us what it said about urban schools in your network and what your reaction to all that was.
So happy to. We paid very close attention to the data, as you might
No
imagine.
doubt.
It is for us. It is our number one goal is to improve educational outcomes for our students. And I know this is a reading conversation, but just to share briefly, kind of a reflection on these PowerPoint slides of what the nation did, and then also what our districts did. The nation overall, as you know, and you can click through all of these, but the nation overall, the average scores for grade 4 reading were up 2 points. There was no significant difference in grade 4 mathematics. There was no significant difference in grade 8 mathematics. And the nation overall overall was down 2 points in both grade 4 and grade 8 reading, which is the impetus for this conversation today. The districts showed a slightly different picture. And on the next slide, we show kind of what the recovery looked like for districts. In mathematics, our districts actually had twice the growth of the nation overall. In grade 8 mathematics, there was no significant difference, but similar to the nation, well, in districts in grade 4, there were no differences in grade 4 mathematics, grade 4 reading, excuse me, and down 3 points on average in grade 8. I'll stay here for just a moment, but one of the things that we wanted to do was really understand what's happening across our member districts. This data represents our large city districts, which even though there are 27 TUTA districts in NAEP, this data is a broader reflection of all of the large cities who are the districts that we serve. In reading, and we'll talk more about that, a number of them weren't significantly different. As a matter of fact, in 3 of the 4 grade subject combinations going back to 2019, our districts are now no longer significantly different from where they were in 2019, which was pre-pandemic. But clearly, there is room for growth. The other thing I want to point out is you'll note in 8th grade, both in math at 8th grade, but also in reading at 8th grade,
Yeah.
those students who were in the 25th percentile didn't see the same, actually no differences. They actually saw significant declines relative to their peers. And we saw a number of our districts actually reverse that trend where they had upper students in the upper performance levels going up. A number of our districts had students going in the lowest performing percentiles going up as well. And so one of the things we wanted to do was learn from them.
Yeah, so I'm particularly curious around that. There were some bright spots in your network. Maybe you could talk a little bit about a couple of those bright spots and any thoughts on what might be contributing to their success when the general trend was like flat being good and a lot of places being worse than flat. What are you seeing with some of those bright spots?
Absolutely happy to. And I think Guilford County Public Schools, Washington, D.C. public school system, so public schools in Washington had significant growth in mathematics, but they also had increases in reading as well for some of their student groups. Again, I shared some of that earlier. And so
Yeah.
one of the things that we did is actually talk to them, some of the tutoring programs that they put in place for students in Guilford County Public Schools, which is actually Greensboro, North Carolina. They reached out to their local universities and really pulled in a number of university students to help provide tutoring supports to their kids, really targeting those university students to provide tutoring supports. They also created learning hubs around the district where students were able to stay after school, get additional supports. So it wasn't just those districts, it was a number of other districts where we saw bright spots. And we're looking forward to learning from them as we really dive deeper into the data and understand what were some of the things that they put in place. A couple of other school districts, Baltimore City Schools, just want to acknowledge the tremendous work that they did in improving outcomes for their students, Philadelphia Public Schools, and others. So just honored to serve those. But one of the things that's important for us is making sure that our districts learn from each other. So we've already begun the process of having some of those districts share with their peers, here's what we did, here's how we did it, so that our districts can learn from each other.
There's so many things I want to ask you, Ray, but let me close this part with a question that I think we'll come back to in the general conversation. Some of the districts you represent have considerable populations that are in deep poverty, not just qualify for various federal benefits, but are really in deep poverty. What are you seeing there?
So on the next slide, and to address your point, so thank you for that question. I think it's an important one. You'll see the districts ranked. Typically, we look at free reduced price lunch as a measure of poverty in our districts, but the council, we look a little deeper than that. Free reduced price lunch is actually 185% of the poverty level. So it's well above poverty. But what we
Yeah.
see in a number of our districts is that, for example, in Detroit, in Cleveland, over 1 in 4 families in those districts have household incomes less than $25,000 per year. You'll see a number of them are less than $10,000 per year, which is an abject poverty situation. And what you'll see on the next slide is a study that was done in Washington, D.C. By Berlinger and Boots, and this was just before the pandemic. But you'll notice kids who are in abject poverty, meaning they're homeless in foster care, qualify for TANF for food stamps, et cetera, in that at-risk category on the right, they're far more challenging to educate than their free and reduced price lunch peers. And many of those students exist in our districts. And so one of the things we look at closely is not just who's moving the needle for all of their students broadly, but who's moving the needle for those students who are in concentrated poverty, often in the same schools and some of our most challenging areas in our communities. And those districts, some of the districts that I mentioned earlier, DC Public Schools, Guilford County, they're moving the needle for these students as well.
Hey, Ray, you did evaluation for a long time. Help us with this chart over here because it's cool looking, but I don't get it.
Happy to. What you'll see is on the right-hand side, an at-risk indicator says percent at risk. But what they've done in this study is they've flagged students who had the abject poverty indicators that you see on the left-hand side of the chart, which is a more targeted look at those kids in the slide that I just showed who
Mhm.
are in much more dire circumstances in terms of poverty. What you'll see in that free and reduced price lunch is that those students in that kind of light pink 0.59, negative 0.59, that is the challenges in terms of their state assessments, and this was the Park assessment, in
Mhm.
terms of their performance and their education levels. But you'll see that the at-risk students are a deeper red, meaning their performance was far more challenging and lower than their peers, even those peers who receive free and reduced price lunch. And that's what many of our schools and many of our districts face across the country.
Wow. Okay. I want to come back to this conversation when we're all together, but I really appreciate Ray, you flagging that issue for us. And I want to ask Melissa, we're going to go from the cities to the much less populated parts of America, of which there are many. Um, Melissa, can you just start out by reminding folks what Rural Education Association does? Like how big, what are we talking about here?
So about 20% of the nation's students go to a rural school. The National Rural Education Association is a national organization that focuses on rural specifically. Obviously, we care about all students, but we're focused primarily on students that attend rural schools. We have 44 going on 45 state affiliates that work with us to give us local information from their perspectives, and then we're able to leverage that at the national level. I work in Arizona, and so I also bring a state perspective on what's happening at a state level as well.
Quick drill down on that
Yep.
answer. I know all the federal departments have different definitions of
Yes.
exactly what qualifies. When you think about a rural school, tell us what you're thinking about. So we'll know what you're talking about here.
Sure. Yeah, there's over 15 federal definitions depending
Yeah.
on which grant. Rural is really a basis of location, distance. So how close are you to a city center that's at least 50,000 people or more? And then there's also issues of access. What we have had conversations around in NREA is what exactly can we say about rural? What we've come up with is if you think you're rural, you probably are. But it does have an issue of small and isolation to resources.
So a small in isolation to resources. So what we might think of for those of us who live in a city, we get the cities, and we get the suburbs, then we have the exurbs. You're not really counting, you're not talking about exurbs so much. You're talking about like beyond the exurbs in more remote areas, less densely populated.
Yeah, typically that's true. Although I will say that there are school districts in the exurbs that have rural schools within their district.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So
Yeah, that
it's a
makes sense.
matter of where they're located. Yeah.
All right. Thanks for that background and locating everybody. What stood out for you in the NAEP results, especially
Sure.
as you think about results for those schools that are in less densely populated parts of the country?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the decline happened across all locales. So, fourth grade students in rural schools experienced a decline just like everybody else did. So, but I think that one of the things that was significant, there were some racial and ethnic disparities. So, some persistent achievement gaps exist between white students in rural communities and their Black and Hispanic peers. And that was something that we saw again, and really just goes to the need for targeted interventions to promote the equity in educational services and supports.
Yep.
Rural female students continue to outperform their male counterparts, especially on reading assessments, which again reflects the need to ensure that those male students are getting the supports that they need. And it also reflects the national trend that we're seeing. It's not different in rural. Um, Lots of students in our rural communities are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and they obviously have scored below their more affluent peers in many of our rural communities. And that just highlights for me the ongoing impact of economic disparities on educational outcomes. And then the other thing that I pulled from the data, and I'm sure many others did as well, is that students, both with disabilities and English language learners in rural schools, scored significantly lower than their peers. And that really just emphasizes for me the need for some specialized instructional strategies and support systems that need to be in place. So we continue to lag behind our suburban counterparts. And especially in reading, that's something that we're still seeing post-pandemic, that learning recovery remains uneven. So while some urban and suburban schools have made modest gains, rural students are still continuing to struggle with lost instructional time and fewer intervention resources. Going as far as the digital divide, we
Mhm.
still have students that have limited access to broadband, which just exacerbates
Yeah.
disparities in home learning and technology-based interventions. So those are some of the things that I've pulled from the data.
All that is, it all rings true.
Yeah, sure.
None of us makes us, cheer. Anything surprise you? Any of the results from the most recent NAEP report sort of jump at you like, oh, that's different than I thought.
Yeah, the math proficiency. I know we're talking reading,
Yeah, but go
but
ahead.
math
We talk some math talk.
math proficiency declines were worse than I think anticipated. And so while reading's been slow to recover, that continued decline in math really is something that's very concerning for me. You had states that had some pretty proactive intervention models that saw some better outcomes with tutoring and extended learning opportunities, strong teacher development programs, and they saw less severe learning loss, which I think
Mm,
goes to what are the things that we need to be standing up and thinking about in our rural communities. So, and then the other thing that I think is important to note is that absenteeism continues to have an impact. And when you have chronic absenteeism as an issue, lower NAEP scores is something that I think we can all correlate and anticipate that that's going to be an issue. Just it was more striking than I think than we anticipated.
yeah, interesting. I was going to ask you what you attribute. I mean, we have some general ideas about what we attribute lower academic outcomes in rural communities. You mentioned absenteeism, which probably has its own special flavor in places that are less densely populated, where people have to travel further for school and so forth.
Right.
You also mentioned when we talked before the challenges around human capital, getting talented people to do every kind of job. You said bus driver to superintendent. Talk a
Yeah.
little about that for a sec.
Yeah, I know that there's a retention issue in all locales as well as a recruitment issue. But with rural populations, it is very difficult. We struggle to recruit and retain qualified teachers and paraprofessionals that provide those support services and support staff, including drivers. And when you don't have transportation that's reliable, where you've got long bus rides and unreliable routes and weather-related conditions anyway, that's very difficult. And we really do try to think outside the box and be innovative around how to keep people under contract.
Yeah.
But the pipeline is it's shrinking. It's very, very difficult to entice people to come to a rural community as well as stay in a rural community. And John, we talked earlier about housing being an issue, that a lot of the things that we're standing up in rural communities are great, but if there's no place for those people to live once they come into your rural community, that is a concern. And so housing has been a big problem that rural leaders are trying to figure out how to navigate. So,
Well, this is all bleak. That was a depressing run here, I gotta say. But tell us, last question before we
yeah.
move on. What are some of the strengths in rural schools that you think you can trade on to improve attendance, get people to work in those places, and improve educational outcomes?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Schools are not just educational institutions in rural communities. They're often the center, the heart of the community, and they are where culture happens, society meets, civic activities take place. Because they're smaller, often we can foster strong relationships between students and teachers, between the school and the community at large, which means that early interventions can be more personalized and immediate. Rural schools can tap into place-based learning, which means you've got local expertise and intergenerational learning. For example, apprenticeships with local businesses or agriculture programs. And if there's an opportunity to partner with universities or community colleges, then there's an opportunity to have some synergy there around the kinds of things that you can do with your programming at your schools, or even stand up, grow your own programs for the adults in the building as well. So
Fantastic. Okay, great. We'll be back to you shortly. Thanks so much. Kathleen,
Hello.
there you are. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's always fun to have you on these conversations. Really appreciate you coming back. So we're going to ask you questions where you're wearing a couple of hats today.
Great.
I know this conversation brings together so much of the work you've done, including stints as a classroom teacher, your work at Stanford and the Manhattan Institute, and your years of being the superintendent of partnership schools. And now you're thinking about leadership and management and implementation. We want to tap all that stuff today. So, but first, let's remind folks, what does the data tell us about Catholic schools, and what do you think we can learn from that?
Yes. So I feel like before I actually get into the data on Catholic schools, I want to put the Catholic school data in context, right?
Great,
Because I think it's very easy when people think of Catholic schools, they sort of lump it into a larger private school category, and they think of Catholic schools as educating the elite, and many do. But actually, the demographics of the average Catholic school, parish or diocesan school specifically, really looks pretty similar to the overall demographics of traditional public schools. And I say that because then looking at the data, you can draw some interesting parallels and potentially draw on some lessons or learn some lessons. And so with that context, I want to say that Catholic schools on average do really well on the NAEP, and they continue to in this latest round. So overall, Catholic schools outperform traditional public schools and charters on all of the NAEP tests, even when you disaggregated by race, and even when you disaggregated by income as well. And in particular, when looking at student achievement between schools with similar levels of low-income students, Catholic schools on average, students in Catholic schools on average perform 2 grade levels above their public school counterparts. So overall, I think Catholic schools do really, really well. And I can speak to my own experience. So partnership schools, it was a network. We ran urban Catholic schools that served predominantly low-income and minority students in both New York and Cleveland. So I want to be careful not to point too sharp a causal arrow, because we know there are lots of different factors that affect the data, but I think there are maybe some interesting lessons there.
So what's it all about? Like,
Yeah, so I think not just for
what do
Catholic.
what do you attribute this this success?
So, I mean, I think in looking not even just at the Catholic school data, but looking at the state data from the most recent round, the most recent NAEP test, I feel like there are 2 stories emerging for me. One is a story of curriculum, and another is a story of school culture. And from my own experience, I think the curriculum story, I'm really actually excited to see that seeing its day in the sun and getting a spotlight, because from our experience, and from my experience as superintendent, choosing the right curriculum and arming teachers with the tools and resources they need to meet students where they are and get them where they need to be can definitely be game changing.
Talk a little about, well, I want to do a little bit of a double click on curriculum.
Great.
Talk about the approach to what that means more specifically
Sure.
with respect to literacy, and
Yeah.
especially early literacy, Kathleen.
Yes. So I think a couple different things. I think that the importance of curriculum and making sure that, again, teachers have the tools and resources they need. And even more specifically, I think the story we're seeing coming out of this round of NAEP is the attention on the science of reading. So if you look at the state level data, states that saw really strong gains or really strong performance on NAEP are states that really made it a priority to ensure that, particularly in the early elementary classrooms, students were getting exposed to reading curricula that focused on the science of reading, meaning things like ensuring that students had explicit phonics instruction and making sure that that was a core part of the early reading programming and the early reading strategy. And from our own experience, my own experience at partnership schools, that was a very strong focus of ours as well. So the curriculum that we chose for early elementary through 5th grade was really grounded in 2 different things. One, what is now being called the science of reading, and making sure it had a really strong, explicit phonics and phonemics awareness program. And 2, for us, something that was really important was knowledge-driven literacy, making sure that our literacy program and our early literacy program was explicitly focused on building student knowledge and vocabulary in a really intentional way, beginning in pre-K and all the way through 8th grade.
That's super interesting. I want to come back to that because Ray also said something similar about a more comprehensive approach to literacy rather than carve it off. Okay, now we're going to go over here and we're going to do this literacy thing with a lot of emphasis on phonemic awareness and so forth. But before we move on, when you say culture, what do you mean?
Yeah, so I think especially when we think about the potential of a Catholic school advantage, we did a lot of digging to understand when we were at the partnership, why is it? So if Catholic schools are beating the odds, particularly in urban centers, why is it, and what is it about Catholic schools or other schools that are beating the odds? And one of the things that the research was bearing out was that schools that had a really clearly articulated mission, vision, and purpose that drove everything else that happened in the school community. So it aligned everybody, made sure all of the adults who were working there were facing in the same direction, in the same boat, facing the same direction and rowing together, that had an outsized impact on student learning. And so when I'm thinking about things like school culture, yes, that has to do with things like discipline policy, but you actually want to go a level above that and think about, is there a coherent and clearly stated mission? For us at Catholic schools, obviously our mission was faith-based and faith-driven, but it doesn't have to be. You can have a really clearly defined mission, a really clearly defined vision that drives all of your decision making and that animates all of the adults in the building and brings them all together. And it doesn't have to be a faith-based one, though in our case, obviously it was.
So Kathleen, we have a question from the audience that
Mhm.
is really interesting. Bring together the curriculum and the culture. What do you do in Catholic schools around teacher prep, which is a big issue in general? I'm really curious how you get people skilled enough to deliver the curriculum and aligned enough to be carriers of the culture.
Yes. So we had a very clear, so one thing that we did was across all of our schools, we had a common curriculum. And that was the foundation for our instructional model and for all of our teacher professional development. So all of our teacher professional development was sort of grounded in and centered on our curriculum, which I think made a huge difference. I know as myself as a classroom teacher, it could be frustrating to go to a professional development that was teaching something different over here, but having textbooks that did this. And it felt very disparate. And I, as a young teacher, struggled to kind of pull it all together. And so one of the things that we tried to do in our schools was make sure that all of our teacher professional development was aligned around our core instructional model and our core curricular model. And so that it wasn't leaving it up to the individual teacher to figure it out on their own day in and day out.
Awesome. Thank you. I have a million more questions, Kathleen. We could talk forever, but I don't want to make Drew and Beth wait forever. But don't go away because I got more. We got more.
Great.
Drew, thanks so much, Kathleen. Drew, can you join us?
Good
Awesome.
afternoon.
Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for your patience. Let's just be clear for everybody what the National Alliance for Public Schools does, who's your network, how many schools, et cetera.
Sure. The National Alliance for Public Charters is the nation's leading advocate for charter schools across the country. We do a bunch of stuff. We lobby and advocate at the federal level. We help states pass and improve charter policies. Charter schools currently serve about 4 million students in about 45 or 40 states and jurisdictions across the country, which represents about 8% of the public school population. So that's us in a nutshell.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Okay, so that background, you just get the NAEP scores. What'd you see as you looked at charter schools?
Yeah, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I would just make an overall point that we think a lot about here at the Alliance. But whenever we hear a narrative about public education, I think it's really important to pull apart the charter story versus the traditional district story because they're often different. And a lot of times that charter story gets masked. So what did we see overall? Overall, we saw scores that were pretty similar to district schools. We were looking at all students in 2024. The one thing I would say, actually two things. First, it seems that charters appear to be making more rapid improvement in math in particular and are kind of holding steady in reading. Districts are seeing a little bit of a dip in reading from 22 to 24. The other thing that was really interesting to us was the subgroup performance. So we looked at performance of Black students, Hispanic students, and white students. For Black students, we saw that charter schools had statistically higher performance in grade 8 math and grade 8 reading. Hispanic students in charter schools had statistically higher performance than district counterparts in all 4 grade and subject combinations. And white students had statistically higher performance in 3 out of 4 subject and grade combinations. So digging beneath the average, we actually see, kind of a different story emerging for charter schools.
What are you taking from that, Drew? What do you think's causing that?
I think charter schools, by their very definition, have a great amount of operational freedom and autonomy. So when faced with COVID in general, but also kind of the situation that everybody has been in over the last few years and thinking about just radical improvement and bouncing back from where we all were in 2022. I think charters have a greater degree of freedom than traditional district schools, and that could be on any number of fronts, many of which have been discussed today. That could be curricular, it could be staffing, it could be rearranging the schedule. I mean, whatever the community or the school needs to hyper focus on the areas of improvement, charters have the ability to do that.
Let me double click on one of the things that Ray brought up. You said that charter schools, the demographics of charter schools are actually notably similar to the demographics of traditional public schools. Maybe you haven't done this, but the kids in really deep poverty, who struggle, as Ray's chart showed us, are those kids, are there many of those kids who are in charter schools?
Yes. It's hard to say with precision because of the way that charter schools are organized in kind of a more diffuse way and less of like a district centered approach. But yes, I mean, we actually, on balance, we serve more Black students, Hispanic students than district schools, and we have a higher percentage of students receiving FRPL. I know we talked about the deeper levels of poverty, but generally speaking, we're serving students who either select us or come to us because they've had a not so great educational experience and parents are looking for better choices for their kids.
Gotcha. Great. Don't go far. We'll be back to you shortly. Beth,
Okay.
can you join us?
I'm here, John. How are you?
I am great. This is a fun conversation, so interesting. It is so nice to have you back. And I just have to tell people I'm especially pleased because the last time we talked, you were the chief academic officer for the Dodia schools, and now you're the big boss. You're the director of Dodia schools. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really an honor to be in this position. So thank you for your kind words.
It's really exciting. So, okay, it's possible that there's some people who don't know what the Dodia schools are, because I didn't just a few years ago. So can you just quickly remind folks what the Dodia schools are, how many of them there are, where they are, et cetera, so people are located for this conversation?
Of course. So the Department of Defense Education Activities serves children of active duty military members and Department of Defense employees. So we have 161 schools in 11 countries, 7 states, and Guam and Puerto Rico, and we serve 67,000 students across our 161 schools.
Awesome. 161,000 students, yes?
67,000 students in 161 schools.
Okay.
And I should note that all of our schools are located on military installations.
They are. Okay, yes. I was wondering about that. Okay. Impact aid has to do with schools that are near military installations and therefore have different tax bases and so forth. Different category, correct?
Different category of schools, right? We are a federal school system with schools located on military installations. So, but good for you for knowing about impact aid. I'm impressed.
I did lawsuits about impact aid probably before you were born, so that's a scary thing. Okay, Dodia schools have historically done well on the NAEP results. True again? What are you seeing?
We were really pleased to again be the top performing school system in the nation on the 2024.
Way to go.
Yeah, thank you. We're really, really proud of our students, our educators, our families, everybody that has made that happen. And we are seeing that we have sustained our pre-pandemic performance. So we're seeing that we've sustained our 2019 performance over time.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. Color me impressed. What do you attribute this to? Like, what can we learn?
So a couple of things, right?
I should point out to people that you were earlier a superintendent in an urban school district. So, other places exist, and so, wear both hats at the same time to tell us what you think. Had you been the superintendent of Hartford, what would you have thought you could have taken from the Dodia school experience.
Yeah, that was the perfect setup, John, to talk about what we've learned. And, we've had some folks come in and take a look at us, some researchers that say, what is it, Dodia? What are you doing that contributes to you continuing to be the top performing school system in the nation? And I put it in two categories, John. The first is that we have unique conditions for success. We enjoy the support of the Department of Defense and military commanders. Talk about culture, right? Education is highly valued. Talk about mission, as Kathleen talked about, right? We have a dual mission in Dodia. So of course it is to ensure that our students have a world-class education. But we serve families who are out defending the nation, and we contribute to military readiness. Our parents cannot be worried about the kind of education that their children are receiving. And so I think that dual mission coupled with the culture of the military. Also, in addition, the military provides incredible supports to families. And some researchers have likened it to kind of a built-in community schools model, if you will, right?
Yeah.
At least one parent is employed. They have health care on the installation. They have access to many other things before and after school activities, after school care, other things like that. So inherently, the system provides those wraparound supports to families. And we enjoy this incredible support so that then we can focus on what matters most for teaching and learning. And that's part two. And part two of our story is that we have been able to focus on, for a decade now, college and career ready standards. So we've raised standards for students, every subject, every grade level. And then again, to Kathleen's point, we have invested in high quality curriculum and resources with aligned professional development for teachers and leadership development. So we've built this entire system around higher standards, and we have had the luxury of being able to sustain that focus over a decade. And that really matters.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I have a question from the audience. Who can be a teacher, or who are the teachers in Dodia schools? Military spouses or others? To say a little bit about who the teachers are.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question, and I often get it. And I forget that people don't realize, who works in our school system.
Yeah.
And our teachers are teachers. They come to us with certification, from any state. And this has been a huge upgrade in our hiring practice, that we will honor any legitimate teaching certification from any state. We do, and that has supported our military spouses, who are a huge part of our community. So certainly military spouses make up our teaching community, our employees overall across Dodia. But our teachers are teachers. You come to us with a legitimate teaching certification, and we will bring you on to teach in Dodia. Somebody asked me that too one time about, who are our principals? Are they officers? Are they active duty military? No, educators like everywhere else.
And let's follow that for a second. What's the compensation like in a Dodia school compared to a traditional public school or a charter school?
Yeah, we enjoy relatively strong compensation. And one particularly important facet of that compensation is if you live overseas, we pay for your, we call it living quarters allowance. So either your rent and your utilities are paid for.
Well, that's interesting because it also makes the teachers part of the community in a different way than it may be, somebody jumping in there, living in the suburbs and jumping in their car and driving to some other suburb. And
it sure does. And I can speak from my own experience. So when I came to Dodia from a public school superintendency, I came to help start up their Centers for Instructional Leadership. I told you leadership development was a huge part of the system that we built. And I said, gosh, this system gets it. They realize that leadership matters. Not only do I want to be part of it, I want to help started up. And so I was assigned to Okinawa, Japan, to our Pacific region. We're in the Pacific, we're in Europe, and we're in the Americas. So I had the firsthand experience of being a member of the overseas community in Indonesia, and I can really attest to the fact that it is like a family. You really take care of each other in a different way because, you know, typically your family, your extended family is not with you. And I think it really does make a difference in terms of how we approach the work and the culture of our organization.
It's interesting. Are there statistics? Are there statistics about how kids in military families who don't go to DoDEA schools do, as opposed to kids in military families who do go to DoDEA schools?
You know, I don't have that at my fingertips, but I have heard from other colleagues that military connected students do tend to do very well. It's not always easy to track students, but people who have looked at that data have said that they tend to do well compared to other students.
Yeah, I mean, here we are, we're talking about the schools and everything, and I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe the kids are just better positioned and the schools it's all whatever.
Yeah, well, I think that I think that it's both, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I think that yes, we have great kids who come from really great families, and again are in this organization that highly values education.
Yeah.
But you know what we do with those conditions for success, I think make a difference too. You know, what we focus on, how we're spending our time in terms of what matters most for teaching and learning, I think also makes a difference for our students.
I'm with you on that. I think that's fantastic. And I think one of the most interesting things you said in all our conversations is while traditional public schools and those who work with them and try to support them are always chasing around after some magical solution. Everything you've always said is there's no specific thing. It's the everything.
That's right. That's right. It's not, and again, I say we're really fortunate to be able to focus on what matters most for teaching and learning, because unlike my experience in the public schools, I don't have to here chase after the shiny object or find what's magic. Again, we have had 10 years to build that system and to really dig in. And now that we're in the process of buying the next iteration of high quality resources, we're digging into what high quality instruction looks like, just going deeper. You know, I think I had shared with you at one point that secondary math was our first curriculum and first subject to come back around where we needed new resources. And it's really important for us to build coherence across the system, right? It's while we have advantages, we have some potential disadvantages, right? You're across 11 countries, 7 states, 2 territories. We easily could become a fragmented system. So we work hard every day on that coherence, bringing our leaders together on a regular basis to really talk instruction and instructional leadership. And all of our superintendents can talk about mathematical teaching practices and what they're seeing in terms of student engagement in math teaching, in math classrooms. And again, I think that has contributed to our success in math because we weren't always the top of the nation. In 2011, we were 27th. And so this concerted effort over a decade to focus on instruction across the system to build a coherent system has really made the difference for us.
Somebody in the audience picking up on what Kathleen said, and then you're talking about curriculum. Is there one curriculum across all of these schools?
Yes, there is. Yes, and that has been so key. So remember, military connected students are highly mobile, right? They move every couple of years with their families. So for us, it's not fair to our students. You know, we have 9 different school districts in our 3 regions. We had 9 different curricula, different sets of standards. That's not fair for our students if they go from one DoDEA school to another. It wasn't fair as they were going in and out of public schools and DoDEA schools, as everybody was working to raise standards and implement college and career ready standards. So we said, nope, we are one DoDEA. We are going to set one set of standards and buy aligned curricula and resources that are used everywhere across the system. Been a huge key to our success.
Yeah, wow. When you think about issues of transience that so plague traditional public schools, and then kids who, there's attendance issues, but then there's also, oh, you might be starting half a school year different and some entirely different approach. What an advantage you have, and assuming transience as opposed to it's this weird thing. Thanks so much, Beth. Let's have everybody join back on screen. There's so many streams of conversation here that are overlapping, and I want to get into some of that. I also really want to encourage people, put your questions in the Q&A box. Um, you've seen me before. If you've seen me moderate before, you know I have a million questions, but I want to know what you all want to hear about from these school districts and these geographic population, specific population things. So let's get into your questions soon. We've already tried, but again, put your questions in the Q&A box. As I mentioned when we started, this is a part of a series of sessions in which we're digging deep into the NAEP data to understand those trends and so forth. One of the trends that we have noticed, and we had a whole session about below basic, is this sort of scissoring effect where there are a bunch of kids who are continuing to do well, and then there's a bunch of kids who are doing increasingly not well. And the below basic numbers were pretty horrifying this year. Are you seeing that kind of separation in your districts, or are you seeing something different? Drew, you wanna kick this off, and then I'll come to you, Ray.
Thanks, John. It's interesting because digging into the percentiles, again, this is another place where we see like a slightly different story for charter schools. So I would say just not to keep it short, like on balance, I do think like most everybody's struggling with the 10 percentile and the 25 percentile, those two groups at the bottom. Charters are similar in that regard. And a lot of places are seeing 50, 75, and 90 kind of buoying the results overall.
Yeah.
There were some interesting places though for charter schools where maybe we were doing like a little bit better than district schools on that. So again, it was kind of interesting to dive into that data.
Ray and Melissa, I'm curious if you all are seeing this kind of thing going on.
I think in general we do, but I think there are districts, as I pointed out earlier,
Yeah.
that are bucking that trend and actually reversing that. What we also see in some of the charts I showed earlier is that we are actually moving the needle for both groups of kids in many of our districts. In a report that we did that I just put in the chat for everyone, we looked at whether or not our districts were reflections of the populations that they serve. I know my colleagues said that their populations reflect public school populations overall. Our populations do not. We have far more students in poverty as measured by free and reduced price lunch than the rest of the nation. And we have a majority of our students who are African American or Latino, well over 60% of the students in our districts. And so what we've seen in both that report and in the data from this most recent NAEP is that a number of our districts are in fact moving the nation's most challenging kids, which is why I mentioned earlier there are lessons to be learned there.
Yeah, I mean that seems like the gold that we need to mine is understanding what's happening in those districts that maybe face the biggest challenges and have done the best in surmounting them. When you find that gold, please call. Um, Melissa, what about in rural districts?
I would agree with Ray that there are bright spots. There are differences in rural schools, just like there are with urban schools, where you have spots of brightness. I mean, rural is not one size fits all, just like urban isn't one size fits all. And so you had some small town rural schools that performed well above the national average, while there were isolated districts that struggled significantly in some of our rural communities. So keeping in mind that we really do have to go beyond a traditional approach. There needs to be more individualization. There needs to be more response to intervention. And I think that Ray's point about urban is something that can also inform rural. I think, as I said in one of my comments in the chat, rural and urban have more in common than I think people realize. And so to Ray's point, just making sure that we pay attention to things that are working that might be scaled or replicated in other areas. And we do the same thing in rural. And often we look to urban for the solutions.
So thank you, Melissa. I want to double click on this question that Ray raised, and Anjali followed it up in the Q&A box about deep poverty and the effects of deep poverty. And it's possible that one of the things that you got going on, Beth, that helps you is you probably don't have deep poverty in your, or not much of it in your districts. But I'm curious about, I talked with Drew about charters about this a little bit before. Kathleen, I'm curious whether you've got kids who fit in this category. The question that Anjali posed had to do with the SES data that is in the NAEP scores. Although I also have to say, paying attention to the webinars that I've been running, there were a bunch of questions about that SES data. You're asking fourth graders how many books you got in your house, and that's how you determine somebody's SES status. That's not exactly science, as far as I can tell. Let's go on this question of deep poverty. Beth, how important do you think it is? I mean, you were a superintendent in a pretty, mixed and hard hit community before. How much difference does it make that you don't have deep poverty in the DODEA schools?
Yeah, I think it makes a huge difference. As I mentioned before, we have our families have a number of protective factors. It's not that we don't have families that qualify for free and reduced lunch. And I saw a question about whether we had the data on the performance of our students that qualify for free and reduced meals. And we aren't able to track that for just a number of kind of internal reasons. But you're right, we don't see that deep poverty that I saw in Hartford. And again, it makes a difference because you can get right into teaching and learning. Students are more readily available for learning. And again, not that we don't have challenges, we need to support students with the frequent transitions they make. We need to attend to students who may need support because a parent is deployed. But we're not seeing the challenges of deep poverty. And again, I think that has been a huge condition for our success. All of the supports that are in place for our families that is provided by the military.
Kathleen, what's your thought on the issue in general, and what's your experience with Catholic schools?
Yeah, at Partnership, we had real experience with that. So in both New York and Cleveland, the vast majority of our students were, Title I eligible. In our 7 New York schools, the average income level was about $30,000. In our Cleveland schools, it was even far below that. Wow. And even between the difference between New York and Cleveland, like calling it deep poverty really resonates with me, because the poverty our students were experiencing in our Cleveland schools was even that much more pronounced than the poverty our students were experiencing in our New York schools. We actually signed our agreement with the Diocese of Cleveland to expand in February 2020, and we took the schools over in July 2020. So if you can imagine a more challenging time to pursue expansion. And what the students in our Cleveland schools experienced, what they brought with them, before COVID, and then what they experienced in the aftermath of COVID was significant. And so, yes, I think it would be foolish to say that deep poverty is not a real significant issue. And the cities and the neighborhoods and the communities that have even more challenges, they have, as we see in the data, an even bigger kind of road ahead of them to close the gaps that are growing.
Ray, when you think about, you raised this question of deep poverty to start with, and you named a couple of places where there's a lot of deep poverty and where they're doing better. But I don't know, can you say that they're doing better with kids who are in deep poverty? Or are they doing better generally and with bubble kids, but kids who are in deep poverty continue to struggle?
The answer is yes. They do continue to struggle, but the answer is yes. We can tell. It's why I shared the District of Columbia Public Schools, because what we did was broke out their data to look at how are kids doing by race and poverty. We've done that in other places, but I also want to make the point that I think it's important now, given where we are and given the challenges that were just reflected by my colleagues of particularly Kathleen and others. I think the important thing now is not to disinvest in our nation's public schools. And the notion that we are considering reducing funding, even considering reducing funding for our nation's public schools, particularly given the challenges coming out of the pandemic from our children, would really set our children up and the next generation up for significant struggles. So our investments in education have made a difference in America. It is the foundation for America, for all of our schools, whether they're rural, charter, urban, Catholic schools. I think those investments are important.
One of the things that we heard in when we talked earlier, Ray, you talked about coherent and comprehensive curricula. Beth, you talked about it also. And Kathleen, you made a big point about this knowledge-based learning. I'm curious to hear more about that. When you say this, the sort of basic psychological notion is that new knowledge adheres to old knowledge, and if you don't have old knowledge, it all seems new and none of it sticks. And sometimes hyperclinical approaches, like the science of reading standing all alone is not very sticky. So I'm curious, Ray, you brought it up originally, this what you're seeing in some of your districts. I'd love to hear a little more about that.
I just think, and I'll be brief. I know my colleagues want to weigh in as well, but I think understanding the full scope of the science of reading and its elements, understanding the importance of background knowledge and comprehension, understanding the importance in oral vocabulary development. We develop our language skills through our oral conversations with our children and treating them, conversing with them as adults. And many of our children, particularly in poverty, don't have the opportunities to feel background knowledge experiences. It's what we see, what we experience as children, which is important. So that full breadth of the science of reading is critical, not just phonics, not just fluency, but the full breadth of the science of reading is critical to kids being able to comprehend. And those are the things that our districts are working through.
Yeah, Kathleen, you want to add anything to what Ray just said about that?
Just to amplify it and echo it, right? I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think the curriculum, that's where curriculum selection becomes so important, is do you have a comprehensive literacy program that addresses all aspects of the science of reading? Not just that you can make sense of the words on a page, but that you have enough knowledge and vocabulary to be able to make meaning out of those sentences, not just to decode them. So, amen.
Yeah, it seems really powerful. For folks who may not have already listened, Emily Hanford, who sold a story, just posted a new episode of that podcast where she looked deeply at what Steubenville, Ohio has done, which has been remarkably successful for a struggling town. And there was so much about this sort of comprehensive, and also what you talked about, Ray, about talking, knowing a bunch of words, then trying to read words, as opposed to trying to read words when you don't know a lot of words, you don't know how sentences work and so forth. So I really, really powerful idea. I'm curious about how you think about two things that we've been talking a lot about and thinking about. One is what we do around kindergarten and kids who arrive in kindergarten who are pretty differently situated, and how we use kindergarten and first grade to get kids positioned so that they can really accelerate their reading skills, math skills, and all that. Melissa, my guess is that kids in rural districts arrive at school for kindergarten in vastly different circumstances than some of their peers. And I'm just curious if there's a specific strategy about trying to get kids to a place where they're really ready to learn.
That's that's a big question, John.
Yeah.
I guess I'll go back to the poverty question, where in rural communities, there's resource scarcity. So you have areas where there are fewer social services, there's food insecurity, there's not mental health supports, and there's also not early there's childcare gaps.
Yeah.
Which means that they're coming to school without some of those very basic foundational things that we would like them to have. And so I don't know if there's any one particular program, but you do have what I've seen stood up are community hubs where many rural schools are doubling as resource centers, offering that childcare, offering parent training, making sure that early interventions are offered for those students. The problems that home visits is another thing that I've seen stood up in many rural communities, where you have rural educators conducting home visits to build relationships with families early and to provide those early learning supports directly. But one of the things that is important to note, I think, is that in rural communities, as we've talked about, there's human capital issues. And so there often aren't the number of people that can provide those supports. Professional development is also a concern. Where are these educators that need to gain the skills around literacy, the science of reading? How are they getting those skills? They don't have on-site literacy specialists, or having to rely on virtual coaching is not something that's easy to stand up a robust program when that's where you're at. So there is oftentimes limited capacity for early intervention, and that really can lead to delayed identification of those reading difficulties.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Melissa. Drew, any strategies that you can talk about for charter schools where kids may arrive in fairly different circumstances, and you need to build those, as Melissa was talking about, those foundational skills onto which you can then build, more specific skills.
Sure. I might be a little bit out of my depth on this, but I'm going to give it a shot, guys. So I mean, the first thing I would say is, I think one of the great things about charter schools is that they're responsive to community need. So the actual design of the school is meant to be responsive to whatever it is that the community is facing in terms of an obstacle. I would say the other thing, and I appreciated this point from Kathleen earlier, I think that is something that charter schools do particularly well, is get everybody aligned, because they are generally like a smaller entity, on like, what is the number one focus for our schools? There's an awareness of data. There's an awareness of, gosh, literacy is like the place where we're really struggling. And then like, that's the most important thing that we're focusing on as a school. And you see that quite frequently in charter schools. So that's what I would offer up here.
That's awesome. Beth, you must have kids who arrive, like 20 minutes before kindergarten starts, and God knows where they may have been beforehand. What kind of supports do you offer in sort of the early school years to help build the foundations for longer term success?
I'm so glad you asked, because I tried to bring to this conversation today some things that were new compared to, the last time I've been a panelist on the program. And I'm really, really excited to announce that this year, DoDEA rolled out universal pre-kindergarten. For a long time, we had kind of a Head Start model. We called it Sure Start, and it was for kind of lower enlisted members. For a long time, our military leaders were saying, look, this is a matter of readiness, and there are childcare gaps, across, where we're stationed. We really believe in the importance of an early foundation. And so again, this speaks to the support that we get from the Department of Defense. We finally said, okay, if we're serious about this, this is what it will take resource-wise. This is what it'll take to have teachers, materials, professional development, just the space to do all that. It was put into the budget this year. So we were able to roll out a universal pre-kindergarten full day for 4-year-olds in 80 of our 90 elementary schools. 250 classrooms. We stood up, hired for that, outfitted it, bought the resources for all of those classrooms. The remaining needed a little bit of construction. We're going to be able to bring on 6 more schools next year, and then the remaining 4 need a little bit more construction. But, we're really investing in pre-kindergarten, and it's play-based experience where children are socializing with one another. We invest in family-style dining, which has been a really, a really big part of the program, but really helps to, raise point about the oral language development before, you work on other reading skills. So that is something new that I'm really proud that we've been able to roll out this year.
Yeah, I love that. That's so interesting. So, one of the areas that we've paid a lot of attention to is you have a bunch of students who are somewhere between kindergarten and 3rd grade who are struggling for whatever reason. And what do we do to really drive towards that 3rd grade reading? And you can do all the right things and still have a struggling student in the 2nd grade. So I'm curious what kind of strategies you've seen in your domains that have been particularly successful, and you want to continue to pursue, and that we have for, at least for traditional public schools, we've got. So for Melissa and for Ray, we have the funding cliff, the ESSER funding cliff, which has been such a source of extra resources around this. But let's start with not the traditional public schools. And Kathleen, you do everything right, and still a kid is struggling in the 2nd grade for complicated set of reasons, right? What's the Catholic school response to that?
Yeah, I think maybe 2 things I would focus on. So one, really maximizing our Title I services in order to provide additional tutoring support. So that is something students in Catholic schools have access to Title I. And one of the things that we really, really tried to focus on at the partnership is making sure that we were maximizing every minute of service provided to every student that needed it. And so finding ways to maximize that agency. So the money didn't funnel to the Catholic schools, the services came, but we could help influence and direct the services and help select who our tutoring providers going to be, what resources and materials are they going to use. So not to be a broken record on curriculum, but one of the things that was huge for us was making sure that all of our supplemental support, whether it was provided from, through our schools or through our title services providers, were aligned to our curriculum so that it was amplifying and deepening the support, not just kind of something else that was happening on the side. So I think that was really, really, really essential. And I think that's incredibly important, especially for Catholic schools, most of which are actually they don't have a lot of resources. And so figuring out ways to maximize the few resources that you have is really critical.
Beth, I saw you. Oh, we got the poll up. So, for those of you watching, please fill out the poll while you're listening, and we're just going to continue up. Continue on. But the poll's super important to us. We look at the data every week, so please fill that out. Beth, you do everything right. Kids still struggling in 2nd grade. Now what?
Yeah, you saw me nodding vigorously when Kathleen was talking about making sure that your intervention resources are aligned to your core curricular resources. That has been key for us. And, you know, to also foot stomp a point that Ray has made, right? Resources do matter. That has been part of our success. You know, we have predictable budgets. We have what the system that we built required resources, right? It wasn't just standards. It wasn't just high quality resources. And then aligned strategic instruction or intervention resources. It was also the investment in professional development for teachers to include. And here I'll tell you just a quick story about how I just saw this play out in a school, to include what we call instructional system specialists, who are like instructional coaches for teachers, right? Because we know meaningful professional development is not just when you sit in workshops or you have sessions of professional development. What we have found really matters is what we call those in-between session events, when the ISSs, our instructional systems specialists, our coaches are side by side with teachers, providing that follow-up support to help them implement what they learned in classrooms. And here was something really powerful about alignment I just saw. I saw one of our ISSs, our instructional systems specialists, working with our strategic instruction teachers, our interventionists, to do planning to make sure that their instruction was aligned with the core instruction that was going on in classrooms. So that has been a real key to us. And I would just say what we talk about a lot now is, you know, we set high expectations for students. How do we make sure we provide the support? You're absolutely right, John. You can do everything right, and there are always going to be some students that need additional support. So the bookend to our CCRS, our College and Career Ready Standards work, has been a focus on multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, to make sure that we are systematically reaching every student.
So now I want to ask Melissa and Ray this question. And the schools that you all think about are most dependent on the public resources and the extra public resources that came. And also, I know your school districts, the schools that you think about, suffer from what Melissa talked about before, which is a human capital shortage. Like, who's going to do all this? We can have all the right strategies, but can we hire people who are going to be good tutors? Do they want to do this? How are you thinking about what in particularly in a moment of what appears to be somewhat declining resources, marshaling those resources that are available to do the most effective thing for the students that are struggling the most? Melissa, you want to kick that off?
Sure. What I will say, because I know we've got limited time and I want to give Ray time to answer too, is honestly, I think it starts with relationship building. That's foundational to everything that we're doing when it comes to student academic achievement. And so making sure that we are putting foundations of teacher-student relationships that are strong. In rural schools, we have tight-knit communities and smaller class sizes typically. So it's easy to spend that time and effort and invest in those relationship building opportunities. And then taking it out to the family and the community and engaging them as well and building that trustful connection with families. It's crucial that we are doing that work to ensure that the families and the community are welcomed into the conversation about what's working and not working for our students, and building things into our school calendars like family literacy nights or bilingual resources and parent mentoring opportunities. So it's that relationship piece that I think is really important.
That's so fascinating and wonderful that you say that, because you know the temptation is to say just more drill, more rigor, and you start right out by saying connection. And it is the most important thing to unlock kids' capacity to learn and create the right conditions for learning. I love that. Ray, how do you think about limited and maybe more limited resources, kids who are struggling, the best strategies for creating better conditions for learning and then better outcomes.
I think I agree wholeheartedly with Melissa. One of the things I was going to share as well is developing, kind of our social emotional skills for our students so that we're actually connecting with them. Beth mentioned earlier, kids socializing early on and then throughout school. But the one thing I'll share as well is our districts have really invested those resources that they've had wisely. I think that making sure we double down on that, understanding what makes a difference. And then the other thing, and when this goes back to your previous question as well around the second graders who aren't yet performing, but that is taking a long-term view of the development of our students. And recognizing, for example, in our case, that I may not, if I'm working with an English language learner, it makes sense for me to invest in both their language and their native language skills, their English and their native language skills. And their English, when they sit down to take an English test in second and third grade, may not be as strong. But by the time they get to fifth and sixth grade, they've strengthened two languages. They've strengthened their vocabulary in two languages. They're more versed. What we see in our data is that those students tend to perform better than their peers long term. So it's really investing in the assets that our kids bring to school with them in kindergarten and building on those assets. Quite often we look at the deficits of students, but students in every community have assets. And so I think making sure that we're investing in the assets that our kids have, growing that makes our kids better long term. So not just looking at the short term view, but looking at the long term view of where our kids will be ultimately.
Well, you guys have been fantastic. I just have to say, this has been a great session. I really so appreciate. I want to ask you all a lightning round, an off the wall lightning round question. We are going to cap off our series of decoding NAEP in the middle of March with a session with state chiefs. We've got 6 state chiefs signed up. So, given what all you know, you can wear your professional hat, or you can just wear, your knowledgeable person hat. What the heck would you like us to ask those state chiefs? Drew, I'm starting with you.
I've just become really interested in the gender differences. So this is like taking off my charter schools hat and just putting on my general researcher hat. And so somebody here, I think it was Beth or Kathleen, had brought up just the academic differences that we're seeing in terms of performance between boys and girls and just how that trend has looked over time. So I would welcome a question related to the performance of young men and if there should be kind of a different intervention or different set of supports for boys as compared to girls.
Love it. Beth?
Well, I would like to ask them how they engage their districts, right? Because one of the advantages that we have had is that in DoDEA, we work as both a state education agency and a local education agency. Yeah. And so many times the people on my team would be like, at headquarters would be like, what are we, Beth? Are we an SEA or an LEA? And I'm like, we're both. And we're both when it is to our advantage. So it was to our advantage when we decided not only the standards, but also procured all of the instructional resources. That's not typical for an SEA. So I'm really curious about how they are able to work with their districts to build coherence across their states.
Awesome. Kathleen.
So I want to channel actually something that Drew said earlier about focus. I feel like if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. So I would want to say, like, you get to only pick one top priority for your state. What is your one top priority going into the next couple of years?
Love that. Melissa?
So given that we may not have NAEP data available moving forward, what I would like them to be asked is, what is the consistency in approach, given that they're not going to have that data moving forward, so that how can they then support each other in learning what's going on within regions or across the country, so that we can now take a look as states together and use the data that we are able to collect at the state level to inform our help moving students forward.
Really good. Ray, the last word, my friend.
Just really quickly, in many of our districts, believe it or not, our students by student group already outperform their states in many of our large urban districts. And the question I have is, how are we partnering with our states to enhance the lessons learned across all of our schools, whether they be rural schools, charter schools, DODEA schools? How are you partnering with districts so that lessons learned about what works for students is being enhanced across the state?
Okay, you guys were fantastic. That was so fun. We could go on forever and ever, but now we're going to stop. It's almost 4:30 on the East Coast. I'm going to hand this back to Hillary. But thanks to Hillary and to Sierra for helping to set this up. And thanks to Ray and Melissa and Kathleen and Drew and Beth. It was fantastic to talk to you, all of you today. And with that, I wish you a good day. And I'm going to hand it back to Hillary to close us out.
I echo all the love and applause coming from our audience. Thank you for sharing, taking the time to have this conversation today, and making time to share with our networks. For those of you who are listening, watching, we encourage you to register for what's coming up. And so next Tuesday, March 4th, we will be doing a partner webinar on for-profit childcare implications, challenges, and opportunities. But that is not the end of the NAEP series. The session on parent perspectives is scheduled for March 11th and will be added to the Zoom shortly. The funder conversation on harnessing the power of communities to help children is scheduled on March 18th. And then the final session on decoding NAEP on March 18th, later in the day, is the perspectives of state chiefs. So please join us for those sessions. Please sign up. I'm going to drop the link in the chat one more time. And if you found something that you're going to use today that's working, let us know. Sarah just dropped that link in the chat for us as well. So thank you all. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, everybody.